just want to start by going over the vocab terms with you from the last quiz. Just so we build up a knowledge bank here. Okay, so remind me what sensibility is.
That is the ability or like to be sensitive to one's emotion, someone's emotions or senses. I know it has something to do with senses.
Yeah.
Using your senses creates like sensitivity.
Remember the sense part of it. It's not so much about emotional sensitivity as it is about being receptive to sense impressions, right? So I gave you partial credit for this one.
Okay.
Because you were kind of halfway there. But the real important meat of this is sensibility is about receptivity to sense impressions. Now, the argument that a lot of 18th century philosophers made was that this then led to benevolence, right? That people who were more receptive to sense impressions would have an easier time, being sympathetic towards others, and this would make them more generous and more benevolent, right? But the key thing about sensibility is this receptivity to sense impressions. So can we connect this to a text?
Yeah, we talked about it with not the monk.
Not the monk, but you're thinking along the right lines.
The review of the monk?
Yeah, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's review of the monk, right, where he's talking about his fears for young people who might be reading this book, right? That their sensitive, impressionable brains might be warped by the overly strong stimulus the book provides, right? It will overwhelm their senses. Okay, cool. What about Gothic follies? What's a Gothic folly?
These were the like architectural buildings or fake funeral looking areas that people used to basically show everyone else that they had wealth and they didn't really have any purpose.
Yeah, because you're basically showing off that you don't have to use all of your land to grow food, right? It's a display of wealth that's also caught up in the same kind of antiquarian, like fake worship of the past craze that the Gothic was a part of. And we can probably apply this to a couple of texts. We talked about it when we discussed the Gothic, but it's probably most relevant to the Mary Wollstonecraft Vindication of the Rights of Man, because she's actually kind of referencing this idea when she talks about the shitty and stupid things that rich people did with their property, right? Although most of the stuff that's related to Burke and Wollstonecraft will be in the next vocab quiz.
Gotcha.
Okay, what about the sublime? What's the sublime?
This is a feeling of either like awe or terror simultaneously both.
Yeah.
It's when like something makes you feel like you're small or lesser than in a way.
Yeah.
It's very much.
Yeah, I mean, it is essentially kind of like the aesthetic sense of being overwhelmed, right?
Right.
So the beautiful, according to this theory, is what excites desire, right? The sublime is anything that excites awe or terror, as you said, yeah. And so we could probably apply this to a bunch of different texts, right?
Yeah.
You could probably apply it to the monk. You could probably apply it to the Aiken and Aiken on the pleasure derived from objects of terror, right? You can even apply it probably to Coleridge's arguments against the Gothic. That he's not in favor of this overly strong stimulus, right? All right. What about horror?
This is when the supernatural is taken as real, like you're supposed to read it as if there's no real solution for it. It's just real.
Yeah, the supernatural events in the narrative in a horror story, or a horror Gothic anyway, are to be taken as real. Good. So we did read excerpts from a Gothic horror novel, which was
excerpts from a Gothic horror novel?
Yeah.
Was that the monk?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just like the chapters from it.
Exactly. Yeah. Matthew Lewis the monk. Yep, that's what we probably apply this to. Now, what about a Faustian bargain? What is a Faustian bargain?
So this one I didn't have in my notes,
Uh-huh.
and I looked it up,
Okay.
and I would just prefer if you explained it to me, because when I looked
Okay.
up, I was like, I don't know about that.
Okay, so
It's hard to look things up.
the Faustian bargain is a motif in literature, right, or in folklore, where somebody makes a deal with the devil
Okay.
in exchange for power or wealth or knowledge or some such thing, right? Colloquially, a Faustian bargain is basically like any kind of bargain you make with somebody powerful that looks good at the time, but is gonna be to your detriment in the long run, right? So Ambrosio in the Monk makes a Faustian pact, right? A literal Faustian pact, where he sells his soul to the devil in exchange for magical powers. But the reason I wanted to include this was that we're going to see this motif again in things that we're going to read later. All right. What is male Gothic?
Male Gothic is when the male or the main male character protagonist is faced with like challenges, and he has to like display some kind of like heroic. That might not be right though.
Yeah, that's kind of halfway there. It's not quite it.
Okay, I found it.
Okay.
A male character who refuses to be bound by society. So yeah, I was off by.
Yeah. So the male Gothic is it's about a kind of overreacher character, right? Who his reach exceeds his grasp, and he tries for something that society would hold him back from. Whether it's power or money or sex or whatever, right?
Right.
So the Monk is a male Gothic text. The Monk is actually probably the classic example of male Gothic. And again, the reason I want to remember this and keep it in mind is that we're going to see this motif evolve in other texts that we're going to look at later. In particular, like the male Gothic protagonist evolves into what in Romantic literature is called the Byronic hero. All right, so what about the Minerva Press? What was the Minerva Press?
This one I would also just prefer you explain.
Okay.
To say, try and say out loud.
Okay, so the Minerva Press was a publishing company owned by a guy named William Lane. And they were one of the primary publishers and distributors of Gothic novels, which also meant that they were an early publishing outlet for women writers that catered to middle-class women's tastes. So many of the writers who were signed up with the Minerva, were published with Minerva Press, were women, and most of the audience for these books were also middle-class women. All right, so what about terror? What's terror as opposed to horror?
This is when the supernatural is not supposed to be taken as real, and it has some kind of logical explanation.
Right.
Or rational.
Yeah, Yeah, they pull back the curtain, and there's some logical explanation for all of the ghostly shrieks or apparitions or whatever that appear throughout the tale, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably the best one to apply this to would be the Aiken and Aiken on the pleasures derived from objects of terror. All right, 2 more here. Circulating libraries.
Those were like libraries, but it was kind of like you trade, not necessarily trade, but like, trade
Yeah.
books, and it just circulates, so it's not like you're going, checking out, but giving it back, you're just kind of trading.
Yeah.
So there's less copies.
Exactly, it's run by the publisher, right? You pay a fee to join, and yeah, they send you a book every so often. When you're done with it, you send it back, and they send it on to the next person, and send you another one, right? Yeah, so this was the primary means of distribution of Gothic novels and other forms of middle-class fiction in the late 18th century. And one of the most successful circulating libraries is run by the Minerva Press. So typically a press that ran a circulating library only circulated its own publications. All right, and last one here. What's female Gothic? How is it different from male Gothic?
Female Gothic is when a woman's like virginity and like it's just kind of on the line. Her
Yeah.
like, essentially dignity.
Mm-hmm.
I would say.
Yeah, her virginity, her wealth, or her life, right? They are threatened by an older male antagonist, typically. And yeah, these plots are, I don't want to say formulaic, but they are kind of formulaic, right? Like, most female Gothic novels have a very strong family resemblance to each other, right? It's the same basic plot structure, right? There's a reason that we call this kind of thing genre fiction. Because there are often stronger similarities between the kinds of things we call genre texts than there are between things that we tend to regard as traditional literary fiction, right? Okay, so do you have any questions about any of this?
The Minerva Press, what text would that be closely related to? Which text would be kind of discuss
Yeah.
that with?
I don't think we actually read a text that Minerva published. I don't think The Monk was a Minerva Press text. So, I mean, this would be something you could just kind of note, like, this was a popular Gothic imprint.
Okay.
And circulating libraries, you could probably relate to books like The Monk, or really just about any work of late 18th, early 19th century prose fiction. Okay, so I've got the stuff up here for next time too as well, right? So for next time, remember to complete vocab quiz 2 by midnight. I know you're going to be away, right? So
I'm gonna just try and, I wanna do like all of my reading and stuff like this weekend, Friday, Saturday before
okay.
I go. So I'm
Okay,
gonna
so
try and
yeah,
get all
okay, so
that.
the quiz will open up Friday morning. So if you
Okay.
can get it done by Friday night, that would probably
Okay. Yeah,
be
I
fine.
can do that.
Okay, the
And
reading.
then the vocab quiz, yeah. And then
Yeah.
just like Monday and Wednesday stuff I wanna get done before
Okay.
I go, so I don't have to deal with like homework while I'm there.
Okay, so I'll send you the guide questions then for Wednesday's class as well. So for Monday, you're going to be reading a little introductory section on the slave trade and the literature of abolition. You're going to be reading the excerpts from Thomas Clarkson's essay on slavery, S.T. Coleridge's brief essay on the slave trade, and the short article by William Cobbett on the slave trade. So I'll just give you a minute with that. I've got up here on the board is a list of wars between Britain and France in the 18th century. So just kind of look this over, look at these dates, and what do we determine from just looking at all of these dates? About how many years in the roughly 100-year period we're talking about here are Britain and France not at war with each other directly?
That depends on which wars include Britain and France.
All of these.
Okay, so no.
Yes.
So no,
Yeah,
so for over 100 years.
Yeah, there's about a 30-year period where they're not directly at war with each other, but they're still having little proxy fights across the Caribbean and across Europe. And the French are threatening to support Scottish pretenders to the English throne, right? So one of the great backdrops to the development of Romanticism as a literary style is this near constant war or threat of war with France, right? And I think it's also kind of interesting to note here, so just how broad the theaters of war here are. So the Carnatic Wars take place in India, right? They're fights, the French and the British fighting over colonies in India. What do you notice about the dates of the Anglo-French War? 1778 to 1783.
That's 5 years.
It's 5 years, right? And what American-British conflict roughly corresponds with this?
The Revolutionary War.
Yeah, so our Revolutionary War, right, that is this big turning point in our history, right, from the British perspective, is just another skirmish in this larger war with France, right? And in fact, the French are supporting the American colonists, not so much because they care about the ideals the Americans are fighting for,
right,
but because they want to fuck the British,
yeah.
right? And so, okay, will this weaken our great geopolitical enemy? Fantastic, sign us up, right? The same thing with the 7 Years' War. So we call this the French and Indian War. Everybody else in the world calls it the 7 Years' War. And the North American French and Indian War is just a very minor theater of this war, right? The Napoleonic Wars between 1793 and 1815, right? So we're also fighting a war with Britain. Near the end of this period, called the War of 1812, right? Again, about 1812 to 1815. But this is, at least from the British perspective, right, just a smaller side skirmish in their larger conflict with the French. So this war with France, this threat of war from France, is kind of all-consuming in Britain in the 18th century, in the beginning of the 19th century. And it motivates a lot of political decisions, a lot of building of infrastructure, and also a lot of kind of the way culture develops. So, what did you think of these poems that I had you read for today?
I thought they were interesting. They were short and kind of to the point. The dispatch soldier I remember reading last semester, like last year. It had like a very eerie feeling to it.
Okay.
I would say. The beginning started off very like this dude, she's out and about, looking around, loving the nighttime. Catches a glimpse of this weird looking dude.
Yeah. I think like there's an interest, like if we're thinking about this poem in terms of sensibility, right? And the idea that sensibility leads to benevolence. It's in the Romantic period that we actually start seeing these two ideas get divorced from each other, right? That sensibility doesn't necessarily lead to benevolence. So we'll be talking about that probably in a little bit more detail when we look at the Coleridge piece for next time. But I think it is worth talking about in relation to the discharged soldier as well. So if you turn to page 745, and we look at the beginning of the poem. So can you just start reading for me from the beginning, and I'll stop you when I want you to stop.
Yeah. I love to walk along the public way for the night, deserted in its silence. It assumes a character of deeper quietness than pathless solitudes. At such a time, I slowly mounted up a steep ascent where the road's watery surface to the ridge of that sharp rising glittered in the moon, and seemed before my eyes another stream stealing with silent laps to join the brook that murmured in the valley. On I passed tranquil, receiving in my own despite amusement, as I slowly passed along, from such near objects as from time to time pre-force disturbed the slumber of the sense. Quiescent and disposed to sympathy, with an exhausted mind worn out by toil and all unworthy of the deeper joy which waits on distant prospect. Cliff or sea, the dark blue vault, and the universe of stars. Thus did I steal along that silent road, my body from the stillness drinking in a restoration like the calm of sleep, but sweeter far. Above, before, behind, around me, all was peace and solitude. I looked not round, nor did the solitude speak to my eye, but it was heard and felt. O happy state, what beauteous pictures now rose in harmonious imagery. They rose as from some distant region of my soul, and came along like dreams. Yet such as left obscurely mingled with their passing forms, the consciousness of animal delight, a self-possession felt in every pause, and every gentle movement of my frame.
Okay, thank you. So let's pause here and think about what exactly is, like what's the situation here that is being set up, and how is the speaker in the poem responding to it?
He's got a good look on everything. He seems like he is like kind of got that like hopeless romantic mindset, just like walking around looking at everything.
Okay, yeah, looking at,
finding
right?
its beauty.
Yeah.
Essentially.
You know, looking at, hearing, feeling, right? Drinking in his surroundings.
Yeah.
How much like sensory language do we see here?
A lot.
Yeah, and you know, he's like feeling revived by the sense impressions that he's picking up here, right? And we're told that, you know, from such near objects as from time to time perforce disturb the slumber of the sense, or that wake his senses up.
Right.
And disposed to sympathy, right? So we're talking here about sensibility and benevolence, right? We're seeing someone with a great deal of sensibility, a great deal of sensitivity to sense impressions, walking about, and thus feeling disposed to sympathy. And then how does that relate to the way he ends up dealing with the soldier?
Well, he brings the soldier somewhere where he can get like the help that he needs. He brings him to a home
Uh-huh.
that he can get help.
He does
Food
bring,
and shelter.
yeah, he does bring him to a place where he can get help, right? But does his sympathy extend so far that he's willing to do the helping himself?
I didn't think that was kind of a
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Is that like, you know, he's like developing
drops
this.
them off.
Yeah.
You guys go, I brought you this.
He's talking to Leela, like drinking in all of these beautiful sense impressions, right? And when he meets the soldier, that's like an interruption of it.
Right.
Right? If we look on the next page, so while thus I wandered, step by step led on, it chanced a sudden turning of the road presented to my view an uncouth shape. So near that, stepping back into the shade of a thick hawthorn, I could mark him well, myself unseen. He was in stature tall, a foot above man's common measure tall, and lank and upright. There was in his form a meager stiffness. You might almost think that his bones wounded him. His legs were long, so long and shapeless that I looked at them, forgetful of the body they sustained. His arms were long and lean. His hands were bare. His visage, wasted as though it seemed, was large in feature. His cheeks sunken, and his mouth showed ghastly in the moonlight. From behind, a milestone propped him, and his figure seemed half sitting and half standing. I could mark that he was clad in military garb, though faded yet entire. His face was turned towards the road, yet not as if he sought for any living thing. He appeared forlorn and desolate, a man cut off from all his kind, and more than half detached from his own nature. So let's try and unpack this description here of the soldier a little bit. What do you notice here?
Immediately his legs. I think he really put emphasis on his height.
Yeah.
His legs. He was lost by looking at his legs. He forgot that his face and body, the rest of his body existed.
Yeah. So does he seem to be looking at this soldier as a whole person?
No.
Or as a collection of parts?
A collection of parts, and it
Uh-huh.
kind of seems like he's observing it in the same way he was just observing outside, like his description.
Uh-huh.
Stuff, his use of language kind of, it's just like he's like the same thing with his senses, just looking at his
Mhm.
student the same way he was just looking at outside. Kind of takes away, like, kind of separates him from being a human and just like an object of observation for this guy.
Yeah. And yeah, he's something to look at and take in, right? And
Yeah.
does he seem like something that is altogether welcome here to the speaker?
This soldier
Yeah.
is welcome. No.
Yeah, I
would say
mean,
no.
this guy, you know, is walking the road, right, enjoying the solitude of the night and drinking in all the sense impressions. And he turns a corner, right? And then suddenly this guy is sitting there in a faded uniform, right, with some, you know, with sunken visage, right, sunken cheeks, wasted visage. His mouth shows ghastly in the moonlight, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, this is almost like an ugly reminder of something, right? When we talk about like words like you know, like ghastly and faded and sunken, wasted. What other kinds of things do we like? What kinds of things other than people do we think of?
Garbage.
Maybe let me put this another way, right? Does this sound like a person who has a strong grasp on the world of the living?
No. Yeah, I think those sound kind of dead.
Yeah, there's like some almost like
Lifeless.
yeah, like a ghost or an apparition here, right? There is something kind of gothic
Yeah.
about the way the soldier is presented. And a ghost is, in a lot of ways, like kind of an echo from the past, intruding on the present, right? Something that maybe you don't want to be reminded of, intruding on the present. And I think that the soldier here fulfills a similar function for the speaker, right? So Wordsworth, he's writing this in 1798. He is not and has never been a soldier. But what's been going on between his country and the country just across the English Channel for his entire life? Yeah. Like to the point where it's almost just like background noise. Especially given that none of the fighting ever actually takes place on English soil. The fighting always takes place somewhere else. We can talk a little bit about that with the Anna Letitia Barbald poem, because I think that's one of the central themes of that, right? Is that England is, by nature, of its being an island, relatively protected. But yeah, did you get a sense of where this soldier came from? Like, where had he been?
I want to say either obviously the war or one of the war hospitals. Maybe. I mean, he was just dispatched, so or discharged.
Yeah. Discharged from where? It actually does tell us. It's on page 747 near the middle.
His station? No, sorry.
Start with he told a simple fact.
The Tropic Isles?
Yeah, so the Tropic Isles would mean probably where has he been? What Tropic Isles would have been part of the British sphere of influence?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I really don't.
Okay, yeah, so he's been fighting in the West Indies. And what do we remember maybe from day one of the class about the West Indies and what the British interest in the West Indies primarily was?
Trade.
Trade, but trade of what specific thing? Yeah,
Tea?
Tea's actually coming from India, right? So we talk about West Indies, we think of the Caribbean, right?
Okay.
So what were the British doing? What were they trading in the Caribbean? What were they producing there?
I want to give an answer, but I know it's not going to be right again.
Something you might put in tea.
Sugar?
Yeah,
Okay.
they're producing cane sugar there, right? And who's actually doing all of the growing and cutting and milling of the sugar cane? Is it the British planters who are doing it themselves?
No. Slaves?
Yeah, it's the slave labor plantations, right? So this discharged soldier who's been to the tropics is actually an unpleasant reminder of several things that are going on in the background of the British psyche throughout this period, right? He's a reminder of these constant wars that are pretty much being fought someplace else, so they don't directly touch most people's lives unless they know someone who's serving, right?
Right.
Somebody who's in the Army, who's in the Navy. And many of these wars are being fought to protect colonial economic interests that are powered by slave labor. And really, like, a lot of British wealth in the 18th century is coming from these sugar plantations, right? So, many wealthy British families who've probably never been to the West Indies themselves, right? Not only are they putting sugar in their tea and in their, in their jams and jellies and, their desserts and whatnot, many of them also own sugar plantations or shares in sugar plantation operations, even though they've never seen the place and probably may not even be directly aware of what's going on, right? But are kind of conveniently ignorant of it. So this discharged soldier for Wordsworth is kind of like this ugly thing that you keep in the back of your mind that's always kind of lurking there. But he turns the road, he follows the turn of the road, and suddenly there it is sitting there right in his path where he can't ignore it. So this is probably a good jumping off point to talk a little bit about the way the war was represented, or the way the Napoleonic Wars in particular were represented to the public, both through official government channels and also by independent artists and by political cartoonists, right, who are trying to speak to the ordinary person. So the music that I was playing at the beginning of class was Beethoven's Third Symphony, which is called the Eroica, not the erotica. Notice there was no T in there. Eroica, right, heroic symphony, which was composed in 1801. And the reason I was playing this is because Beethoven dedicated this symphony to Napoleon Bonaparte, right? To this new French emperor who had arisen out of the revolution. And the reason for this is to somebody like Beethoven, who was himself kind of like a self-made celebrity, and to a lot of artists, Napoleon represented the triumph of talent and intelligence over birth, right? This wasn't a guy who was born a lord or a prince. This was a smart, hardworking guy who had got himself to the top of the heap through talent. Now, Beethoven's opinion of Napoleon sours a bit when Napoleon shows up in Vienna and starts laying siege to it and blowing up buildings, right? Then he's maybe not so fond of him. But yeah, so in the early years of the Napoleonic Wars, a lot of artists in particular thought that Napoleon was going to be a kind of liberator who was going to break down these old structures of, kings and princes and bishops that, many people felt had been oppressing them for so long. Now, he ends up being just another kind of oppressor. But there was a lot of hope that he wouldn't be when he first came to power. So I want to show you a caricature here from this period. So one of the best known cartoonists of this period is a guy by the name of James Gilray. And Gilray was often on the government payroll, so he would sometimes be paid to produce propaganda pieces, but on his own, he would produce cartoons that were often just as critical of British policy as of French, right? So what we have here is a cartoon called The Plum Pudding in Danger, and this is from 1805. And what Gilray has done here is, taken advantage of the fact that a Christmas plum pudding, right, we can see the steam rising of it, is a big round ball, like a globe or like a cannonball. And we have here on your left the British Prime Minister William Pitt, and on your right Napoleon Bonaparte, carving this up between them, right? And what do we notice about what's being carved here, about how they're doing the carving?
Well,
Who's actually taking, what's that?
He's taking half the damn globe.
Yeah, William Pitt is taking the entire Western
He's
Hemisphere,
getting a
right?
little sliver.
Where Napoleon is just solely focused here on Europe, right? He's just taking that little slice out. But what else do you notice about the way Napoleon is presented here?
He doesn't necessarily look.
What do you notice about his size?
Smaller.
He's a little fella, right?
Yeah.
And with a great big hat. Now, this particular way of depicting Napoleon is so prevalent in this era that we develop a term called Napoleon complex, right? For somebody who we think is overcompensating for being too small, right?
Was he
Gilray,
actually small?
no. This is actually the point I'm about to make, is that it's because of Gilray's cartoons that we tend to think that Napoleon was very short. He was actually about average height for his
Was
time.
James Gilray English or French?
Gilray is an Englishman.
Okay.
Yeah. Although, as we can see, he's often just as critical of the English as the French.
Yeah.
So we see, William Pitt, has he's got a weak chin and the kind of snooty-looking aristocratic nose, right? So you kind of look like a caricature of the upper-class Englishman.
Right.
And Napoleon is a little guy with a huge hat. I don't know if you've ever seen there's one of my personal favorite movies. It's called Time Bandits. It's this kind of like comedy fantasy movie from the early 80s with these magical dwarfs who run through time to steal objects from famous people. And it's pretty great. But they visit Napoleon, and Napoleon is obsessed with height, right? And he's angered by anything that's taller than him. So he's watching a show in a theater while his army is conquering Italy, and the theater owner is just trying to keep him amused so he doesn't shoot him, and he demands more little things hitting each other. Right? That's what I like, little things hitting each other. It's pretty great. Take my word for it.
I'm definitely gonna watch it.
Yes. You can stream it on HBO Max.
Perfect.
But so to give you another sense of ways in which Gilray was often critical of British policy. So this is an earlier cartoon called John Bull's Progress. This is from 1793. So early in what we now call the Napoleonic Wars, even though Napoleon hadn't even come to power yet in 1793. But it's early in these late 18th century, early 19th century wars with France. So John Bull is this kind of like in the 18th century, John Bull is just kind of like this figure of like the archetypal English countryman, right? Has no strong opinions about anything, likes his likes his little pot of ale, likes his home comforts. His opinions are those of the average English rural person of the day, right? Relatively prosperous middle-class person. So he's usually used as a kind of caricature of the rural middle class, right? So what Gilray has done with this already familiar character is shown what happens when John Bull falls for the recruiter's promises and goes off to war, right? So here he is, happy at home, roaring fire, cat and dog asleep at his feet. He's snoozing with his little mug of ale. Children are playing with a pet bird. His wife is spinning thread. Daughter coming in with a pail of milk. And then here he is in this fancy new uniform, right? Marching off to war with the others. You know, he's excited by the pageantry and not looking back. What do we notice about his family? How are they reacting?
They don't want to go.
Yeah, the kids are pulling on his coat, right? No daddy stay, right? The daughter is looking away. His wife is crying. And here we have John Bull's property in danger. So what this little line with the three kind of pendulums hanging off of it indicates the pawnbroker.
Okay, so
So-
they're going to sell all their stuff.
What's that?
They're going to sell all their
Yeah. Now that the family breadwinner is gone, the family is the family's in poverty, right? They gotta put everything in hock. And now John Bull makes his glorious return. And what do we notice has happened to both John Bull and his family here?
They've lost some weight.
Yeah, they've all lost some weight, right? And we see that John Bull has lost some other body parts as well. He's
Yeah.
lost an arm, he's lost a leg, he's lost an eye, and they're all thin and wasted.
And their house is definitely not what it used to be.
Yeah,
No kitties.
yep, no cat, no dog, no pet bird, yeah. All that's gone. Yep. Not to be, everybody looks like they're starving, right?
Yeah.
So the basic argument here being, right, if there's nobody staying home to work the land, right, if everybody's going off to fight in these patriotic wars, then the whole condition of the country suffers. Right? Everybody ends up wasting away, especially, right, vulnerable women and children. Right? I think that's kind of where Gilray is kind of digging in the deepest threat there, like trying to hit those emotional buttons.
Yeah.
Is there not so much the threat to big fat happy John Bull, but the threat to the family. The family appears in every panel and John Bull doesn't. So these are the kinds of arguments that are circulating in the popular press about the war. And it's actually, another thing to note here is it's kind of during this period that we have the emergence of what's called the public sphere. So is this a term that is familiar to you at all?
Public sphere, isn't that just like where kind of everything like news, that kind of stuff is circulated?
Yeah, that's a big part of it, yeah. So this term is coined by a German philosopher by the name of Jürgen Habermas, I think in the 1960s. But what Habermas, means by this is essentially, public means of circulating information and participating in debate about civic issues, right? So in the 18th century, there are printing presses, right? There are newspapers, there's a postal service, there are coffee houses, there are public parks, right, where people can go and debate with each other about important issues. It's not something that's just kind of left to their social betters anymore. There are means for ordinary people to circulate their opinions and get them heard. And so when we talk about the emergence of a public sphere, this is what we're talking about. Now, this doesn't mean that official narratives don't sometimes try to dominate the public sphere. So, as we can see in this panel here, right, one of the big kind of appeals to the public that the government made was through pageantry. So if we turn to the Robert Southey poem, so victories and funerals were both usually kind of indicated by the ringing of local church bells, right? If there was a great victory, then church bells would be rung throughout the country. Because remember, what's the relationship between the Church of England and the government?
It kind of runs the government.
Yeah, or the government runs it, really. Yeah, the Church of England is a government department.
Right.
So religion and state are very closely intertwined here. So whenever there's some kind of great war victory, the church rings the bells, right? They ring them across England. Church bells are also rung for funerals of prominent individuals. So, for example, when Admiral Horatio Nelson was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar, which was also a great naval victory, there are processions in the streets throughout England. There are church bells rung across the nation in mourning for our great hero, but in celebration of his great victory, right? And they also start erecting monuments all over the place to this guy. You will find Nelson's columns or Nelson's pillars in cities throughout the British sphere of influence. One of the earliest ones was built in Dublin, but a bunch of Irish nationalists blew it up in the 60s. And what we have here, we have Admiral Nelson on top of the pillar, right, looking down on everything around him. Right, so we have that aesthetic of the sublime here, right? This is supposed to inspire awe.
Right.
And there's a closer view. We see that he's missing an arm. He's got his naval uniform. He's sitting on a coil of rope. He's got his admiral's saber, right? All of these trappings of naval glory, medals on his chest. And the other kind of great hero of the Napoleonic Wars is the Duke of Wellington. So this is the Wellington Monument in Dublin where he was born. This was too big for the Irish nationalists to blow up. We just have this big imposing obelisk, right? That's meant to convey power and authority and majesty. It's in the middle of Phoenix Park in Dublin. And there are also these equestrian statues of Wellington that go up all over the country. This one is in Glasgow, and the reason I chose this one is because as a protest against some government policy, I don't remember exactly which, local artists chose to put traffic cones over the head of Wellington and his horse. So we also sometimes have members of the public trying to reclaim public space by either destroying or defacing a monument, right?
Yeah.
So let's look at another attitude towards these public celebrations in Robert Southey's poem, The Victory. So can you start reading for us with the Hark How the Church Bells Thunder in Harmony?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hark, how the church bells thunder in harmony, stuns the glad ear. Tidings of joy have come, good tidings of great joy. Two gallant ships met on the element. They met, they fought, a desperate fight. Good tidings of great joy. Old England triumphed, yet another day of glory for the ruler of the waves. For those who fell, 'twas in their country's cause, they have their passing paragraphs of praise. and are forgotten. There was one who died in that day's glory, whose obscure name no proud historian's page will chronicle. Peace to his honest soul. I read his name. 'Twas in the list of the slaughter, and blessed God, the sound was not familiar to mine ear. But it was told me after that this man was one whom lawful violence had forced from his own home and wife and little ones, who by his labor lived, that he was one whose uncorrupted heart could keenly feel a husband's love, a father's anxiousness, that from the wages of his toil he fed the distant dear ones, and would talk of them at midnight when he trod the silent dead. With him he valued, talk of them, of joys that he had known, O God, and of the hour when they should meet again, till his full heart, his manly heart at last would overflow, even like a child's with very tenderness. Peace to his honest spirit. Suddenly it came, unmerciful the ball of death, for it came suddenly and shattered him, and left no moment's agonizing thought on those he loved so well. He, ocean deep, now lies at rest. Be thou her comforter, who art the widow's friend. Man does not know what a cold sickness made her blood run back when first she heard the tidings of the fight. Man does not know with what a dreadful hope she listened to the names of those who died. Man does not know, or knowing will not heed, with what an agony of tenderness she gazed upon her children and beheld his image who was gone. O God, be thou her comforter, who art the widow's friend.
Thank you. So where do we notice the tone in the poem changing?
It was after she was talking about reading the names, or talking about the woman reading names and seeing that one name but it was a name that wasn't recognized. Or not the woman, but reading the names and then thinking about, I guess, how
so yeah, like what's the tone that we kind of start with?
I would say like not necessarily happiness, but like joy,
Yeah.
excitement.
Yeah. Old England
Pride.
triumph, right? Yeah, yeah. The church bells are ringing. This means a victory, right?
Yeah.
But again, why else do church bells ring?
Funerals.
Also for funerals, yeah. And I think that like this first little verse paragraph and the last verse paragraph are kind of parallel to each other, right?
Yeah.
You have the public response and then the private response, right? The wife who's left behind is tortured by the ringing of these bells, and when the names are being read out of those who were killed, she's kind of desperately wailing, please don't name my husband, please don't name my husband,
Yeah.
please don't name my husband, right? The other thing to note in this is, so John Bull in the little cartoon we just looked at was a volunteer, right? Or it looks like he was anyway, right? He's happily marching off, all swept up and everything.
Yeah.
Was this guy a volunteer? Did he actually join the Navy of his own volition?
No. I do not think so. It said had force from his own home and like the little ones.
Yes,
Lawful violence.
with
and
lawful
force.
violence, yes. So this was a common practice of the British Navy in this period. It was called impressment. Right, you would have recruiting sergeants going throughout the country, beating a loud drum, summoning people to come and sign up. And if they didn't get good enough results, then groups called press gangs would show up and basically kind of grab any able-bodied male and give him a weapon and put him on a ship, right? Sometimes British Navy ships would actually stop merchant ships at sea and press some of the sailors into service as well. This was actually one of the issues the War of 1812 was fought over, was that the British were stopping American ships and pressing American sailors into service in the British Navy. This guy was impressed into service. Now we also see that recruiter's death drum referenced at the beginning of the Anna Letitia Barbald poem. And so we're running short on time, so I just kind of want to touch on this. I don't want to ignore it. But Barbald is one of those writers, you remember how we talked about literary periods in the first class and how they kind of don't really, like, we kind of give periods these kind of clean begin and end dates, but there's really a lot more kind of like fuzziness to those borders and a lot of bleed between periods. Barbald is one of those writers from an earlier period who survives into the Romantic era, right? And so she still writes in a very earlier 18th century kind of style. She's 70 years old when she writes this poem. And because it's not celebrating British power or British victory, she's vilified for it in the press and never writes again. So, here's an old lady who's worried about the direction her country has taken, and is basically silenced after this by the nastiness of the critical response, right? But if we look at the beginning of this on page 754, right, 1811, right, still the loud death drum, thundering from afar, o'er the vexed nations pours the storm of war, right? That loud death drum is the recruiter's drum going through the villages, rounding up soldiers. To the stern call still Britain bends her ear, feeds the fierce strife, the alternate hope and fear, bravely though vainly dares to strive with fate, and seeks by turns to prop each sinking state. Colossal power with overwhelming force bears down each fort of freedom in its course. Prostrate she lies beneath the despot's sway, while the hushed nations curse him and obey. Bounteous in vain, with frantic man at strife, glad nature pours the means, the joys of life. In vain with orange blossom scents the gale, the hills with olives close, with corn the vale. Man calls to famine, nor invokes in vain, disease and rapine follow in her train. The tramp of marching hosts disturbs the plow, the sword, not sickle, reaps the harvest now. And where the soldier gleans the scant supply, the helpless peasant but retires to die. No laws his hut from licensed outrage shield, and war's least horror is the ensanguined field. So I want you to kind of keep this little verse paragraph in mind here, because we're going to see this same sentiment applied 25 years later by Thomas Carlyle in Sartor Resartus, right? This idea of war as waste, of life, of fertility, of natural bounty, right? And I'm just going to skip to the end here to kind of get that sense of threat here that's kind of throughout the poem. And think'st thou, Britain, still to sit at ease, an island queen amidst thy subject seas, while the vexed billows in their distant roar but soothe thy slumbers and but kiss thy shore, to sport in wars while danger keeps aloof, thy grassy turf unbruised by hostile hoof. So sing thy flatterers, but Britain know, thou who hast shared the guilt must share the woe. So what does she seem to be predicting here for Britain?
Well, she seems pissed.
Okay, that's fair, yeah.
She's kind of just saying, like, so you guys keep doing what you're doing, but just know that you are the reason for this. Now you're gonna have to deal with the rest of it.
Yeah.
Everyone upset. The pain, the suffering, the
Uh-huh.
loss of property,
Yeah,
people.
and why hasn't this touched Britain yet? We did already talk about this a little bit, right? What's geographically special about
It's
it?
not on there. It's not on there.
Yeah, exactly. Because they're an island, they have some defense, right? They can see threats coming typically, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, she's argued that that's not going to protect you for much longer, right? That the threat of war is coming. And at least some people took the idea of like an actual threat of invasion seriously enough that they did start building defenses. So this and this are examples of what are called Martello towers. And around 1800, these start going up, these round, squat brick towers on the coastline, kind of throughout British dominions, right? So you can see there are still some. They're in England, they're in Wales, they're especially in the Channel Islands, right between England and France. You see them in Scotland. There's some of the Caribbean as well. James Joyce, the Irish novelist, actually lived in one for a couple of months. But yeah, they're very sturdy, very well built. And they're mostly meant to be like, yeah, they're fortified, right? But for the most part, they're observation towers. And the idea is that you can see a threat coming from overseas. And in a lot of ways, they're a symbol, like just as the Nelson columns and the Wellington statues were kind of projections of British power and authority and pride and victory, the Martello towers are a projection of insecurity and paranoia, right? Of actual fear of invasion.
Right.
So even this kind of official response in the building of infrastructure is kind of two-faced. Okay, we're about out of time, so do you have any questions about anything?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
If I do, I don't think so.
Okay, so I'll give you the guide questions for next time. I'll email you the questions for next Monday and Wednesday.
Okay.
Or for next Wednesday, I guess, is right.
Yeah.
And I'll let you know when the videos post.
Okay, is there gonna be a quiz on this or Wednesday?
There will be a quiz next week, so I'll let you know when.
Okay.
You know, but essentially, I'll just let you make it up.